you very much for the opportunity to be with you, and I appreciate the work that you do on behalf of our communities. And I thought what I would do is just talk a little bit about WRDA, talk about some other water infrastructure related activities that I hope our committees can work on over the next 2 years, and then talk about Sandy relief, and then I'd be happy to take your questions. With WRDA, pardon me, you all know we haven't had a WRDA since 2007. You also remember that WRDA passed with broad bipartisan support, was vetoed by President Bush, and then in an overwhelming margin, that veto was overridden. So it used to be that WRDA was something that brought the Congress together. I'm not sure that that's the case any longer, but I am very, very encouraged to hear Chairman Schuster talk about how WRDA is his #1 priority for calendar 13 to get that done. I've met with Chairman Gibbs, chairman of the Subcommittee on Water Resources. He also has WRDA as his #1 priority. It's certainly a very high priority for me, and it's a high priority for Ranking Member Rahal. So I am hopeful that we can get something done. Now the challenge will be, how do you draft and pass a project-driven bill in a way that does not run afoul of the earmark ban? And thus far, I at least am not aware of any sort of innovative solution to that problem. There's been some talk about doing a WRDA that would be projects of national significance only. We'll see. Senator Boxer is working very hard on the WRDA in the Senate. She's determined, she says, to do it in an earmark-free way. I wish her the best, and I say that with sincerity, not with sarcasm. I hope that that we, that is a path that goes forward. There's also some discussion on the part of some members to see if there would be a tolerance for defining the earmark ban, or defining earmarks in such a way so as to exclude federal money that would flow from the federal government to another level of government, let us say a town or a city or a county or a village, and have those projects be, if you will, exempt from the earmark ban. Whether that is a discussion that has legs or not is way too early to tell. But there is no question that we need to move on WRDA. We have an enormous backlog of projects that members are very interested in being addressed. We have a number of projects that have previously been authorized that are bumping up against their cost cap, and given the current definition or current understanding of the earmark ban, to raise the cost cap of a particular project would constitute an earmark. So we are in the position, we in the Congress are in the position of basically allowing projects to grind to a halt because they have reached their cost cap, or waiving the cost cap and basically giving the Army Corps of Engineers, by the way, an agency with which I hold in very high regard, but we would be giving any kind of, if you will, fiscal oversight. We would be giving away any kind of fiscal oversight that the Congress would maintain in terms of imposing cost caps. So it's a tough choice for Congress to make, but it's clearly one we're going to have to make. So we're either going to have to say raising the cost cap in a fashion that is driven by Congress does not violate the earmark ban. It's not an earmark. Or we have to say to the Corps, okay, you guys know best, go at it. My own view would be the former as opposed to the latter, but we'll see how that goes. But what is encouraging, very encouraging, is the approach that Chairman Schuster has taken thus far. I believe that he is determined to return the T&I committee to what I view as its legacy, which is conducting its affairs in a bipartisan fashion. That was certainly the case the first 8 years I was a member of the committee, 4 years under Chairman Young, 4 years under Chairman Oberstar. It was decidedly not the case in the 112th Congress, and I really do believe that Chairman Schuster is determined to have the Transportation Committee function in the bipartisan way that has been its tradition for a long, long time. I was also encouraged at the very first hearing the chairman held was a hearing on the federal role in financing infrastructure investments. I think that's very important, and again, a bit of a departure from where we were in the last Congress. So I'm optimistic. I don't have the answers, if you will, in terms of how we're going to deal with the project-driven nature of a WRDA bill, but I'm optimistic that we're going to do something collectively and cooperatively and effectively on WRDA over the next several months. And I also believe that it is absolutely essential that we do that, because, as I said, we've got a pretty extensive backlog of needs that have to be addressed. Let me talk about three other water-related projects that I hope we can move. I have a bill. It was H.R. 3145 in the last Congress. I don't think we're about to file it this week, so I'm not sure what the new number will be. That will really expand the federal investment in wastewater infrastructure, clean water infrastructure. It would provide $13.8 billion over the next 5 years to the SRS. It would create a clean water trust fund, and it would also create a financing mechanism similar to the TIFIA financing mechanism that is in the highway bill. We're calling it WIFIA. We're very, very creative here. So we're taking a toolbox approach to addressing a need that is, I think, extensive and has been largely ignored in recent years. As recently as 2010, we, the federal government, provided $4.3 billion to the SRF, which then went out to the states. My state, New York, gets 11% of that, so we got, round numbers, $500 and some million of wastewater infrastructure funding. The total amount that we're going to spend in fiscal 13 for contribution to the SRF is about $700 million nationally. So New York got $500 million in 2010. Nationally, we're going to spend $700 million in 2013. Not anything approaching the scale and scope of what we need to do. The estimates are that we have $300 billion worth of wastewater infrastructure needs that have to be addressed. And for me, this is a no-brainer. I mean, this is one where everyone wins. We're gonna improve the environment. We're going to put people to work, and we're going to create an environment in which economic development can occur. I'll just talk about my district. I represent the eastern end of Long Island. I have about 300 miles of coastline. I have 2 estuaries of national significance. And so how we deal with our waste is really, really important to the quality of the surface waters that surround us and are within us. And only 30% of Long Island is sewer. 70% is septic tanks. So we've got a problem, and we've got waterfront communities that simply cannot expand in terms of new businesses or anything like that, because there's no reasonable, environmentally responsible way of dealing with the waste. So that's a real hindrance to economic development. So if we want to talk about helping job creators do what they do and helping small businesses be the engine of our economy, we've got to provide the environment. One of the things that is just a truism of how our country has evolved is job development in our country has always been a partnership between the public sector and the private sector. And it has been the public sector's responsibility to provide, if you will, the environment or the framework that allows the private sector to do what they do best, which is innovate and create and build jobs. This is part of providing that context, part of providing that environment to provide a way of dealing with the waste. So I'm very hopeful that we can move on this. I'm going to file a bill this week I'm right now working to develop some lead Republican sponsors to join me. We'll get a lot of Democrats on the bill, but I really would like to have a lot of Republicans on the bill. My lead Republican in the last Congress was Steve LaTourette. As you know, he's now retired, which I say unfortunately he's retired. He's a great guy. I'm hopeful of having a good group of Republican co-sponsors, and then I'm hopeful of that Chairman Gibbs and Chairman Schuster and Ranking Member Rahal and I can work on this in a way that really moves it out of committee. Again, I will say, this used to be the kind of thing that would fly out of committee with broad bipartisan support. It would pass the House with broad bipartisan support. I'm hopeful that we can recapture that sense of cooperation. Two other areas that I'm hoping we can work on. One is the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, and the other is something that as recently as 18 months ago I didn't know existed, which is called the Inland Waterways Trust Fund. Who knew? At any rate, both I think the way in which we deal with both need to be reformed. We've got an $8 billion balance sitting in the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund that we're not addressing, and we take in about $1.4 billion a year, and we spend about 700 million against that. Now, we've got dredging and harbor maintenance needs all over this country, we've got berthing channel needs all over this, or not all over this country, but certainly on both coasts, more so the West Coast. And so I'm hopeful that we can find a way to finance the spending, the proceeds that are currently sitting in the trust fund, and then on an annual basis, if we take in 1.4 billion, we're going to spend 1.4 billion, because we're going to have a lot of work to do to get our major ports ready for the new shipping that will be coming through the Panama Canal sometime in the next 2 to 3 years. And we also have all kinds of needs for less obvious ports. I mean, again, I represent a district that has the two largest fishing ports in the state of New York, Port of Shinnecock and Port of Montauk. And there are ongoing harbor maintenance needs and inlet dredging needs there that at the present time we're not addressing adequately, and also with the earmark ban becomes much, much more difficult. I mean, whenever I argue with people about whether or not we should have earmarks, let's remember that the Army Corps of Engineers budget is 100% earmarked. It used to be that it was 75% executive branch, 25% legislative. It's now 100% executive. And so what I was saying was, who do you think is spending more time worrying about the Shinnecock Inlet, me or the director of the ONB? I think I win that one. I think I'm spending more time worried about the Shinnecock Inlet than he or she is. Anyway. And then Inland Waterways Trust Fund, basically the same issue. We've got an aging infrastructure. We've got an infrastructure that is, a piece of it takes up a huge chunk of what we spend out of the Inland Waterways Trust Fund, and we've got to reform the way that operates. So I'm hopeful. Again, I've talked to Chairman Gibbs about all of these, so he knows what my interests are. I certainly have the support of Ranking Member Rahal, so I won't say I'm confident. I'm hopeful that we can move in some of these areas. Lastly, let me talk about Sandy recovery. You all know, that we've got $50-some billion of recovery funds that will be divided between New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, with the overwhelming portion of that going to New York and New Jersey. We've got a lot of coastal shoreline restoration needs. Again, not all my district, but I represent probably 80% of Fire Island, which is part of the Barry Beach structure that protects the mainland of Long Island. The dune structure of Fire Island is essentially flattened, so a very serious problem, and we at this very moment are very exposed to any kind of storm system that is going to happen. So if we get our traditional, late winter, spring nor'easters, we're going to have some problems. As you know, Staten Island was devastated, the western edge of Long Island, Long Beach, Far Rockaway, Lindenhurst, those areas were just devastated, and then the New Jersey shore was devastated. Thankfully, my district, the storm had less of an impact as you move further east, and so my district had a lot of flooding and a lot of coastal erosion, but we did not have as much of the structural damage that occurred further to the west and in New Jersey. But we've got a real opportunity here. We've got $50-some billion. We've got language in the Sandy supplemental that allows the Army Corps of Engineers to restore to design specification as opposed to restoring to pre-storm condition. That's really, really important. We have a hazard mitigation fund, which is going to bring hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more, to areas, to municipalities, so that we can not only restore, but restore in a way that will hopefully withstand future storms. And so I think we have a real opportunity, but let me tell you, we have got to do it right. We have got to do it right. I mean, for the first time since I've been here, damage supplementals became a controversial issue. I mean, every other week, within 2 weeks of Katrina, we had $60-some billion on the way to Louisiana and the Gulf Coast. It was 9 weeks, and I mean, let's just look at how many people voted against it. So there's going to be an enormous amount of scrutiny. There's going to be an enormous amount of finger pointing, second guessing, I told you so. So it is incumbent on all of us, and I think a lot of this falls to the community that you represent, and the community of professionals that you represent, that we've got to do this right. Because if we don't do it right, I think there's going to be hell to pay, both practically and politically. Let me stop there. Is that okay? And I'd be happy to take your questions. So, thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Congressman. Questions from the audience?
Please speak your question to the microphone so that we can have the audio for recording purposes.
Are you looking at any new funding mechanisms under WRDA?
For WRDA? I'm not aware of any. I mean, there are the things that we've talked about, public-private partnerships, private activity bonds, that kind of thing. But I mean, it would be primarily funding that would come through the appropriations process. But certainly in the bill that I'm dealing with, which I know is not your question, of HR 3145. I mean, we want to encourage public-private partnerships. We want to encourage, we want to lift the cap on private activity bonds, that kind of thing. So I do think that we have to explore. Alternative mechanisms of financing. The environment is such that the traditional ways that we financed infrastructure projects may not be sufficient anymore. And the other issue we have is, the elephant in the middle of the room that I have not spoken about is sequestration. Just the Sandy, we lose $3 billion to sequestration for the Sandy relief. Now, and let's remember that the Sandy relief initial request was $80-some billion from Governors Christie and Cuomo. And that, by the way, was not a padded number. That's a real number. What we passed, including the increase in the flood insurance, was $60 billion, and now that number is going to get back down by another $3 billion, presumably, as of Friday. And the Army Corps of Engineers, we're going to cut their budget by $600 million. We're going to cut total infrastructure funding in fiscal 13 by over $4 billion just from sequestration. So we're in an environment in which I think, at least in terms of what is a proven job creator, we're going in the exact wrong direction. The best way for us to get ourselves back on track financially, fiscally, is to have a growing economy. And infrastructure investment is integral to a growing economy. And yet the prevailing mindset seems to be that the way we have a growing economy is by imposing austerity. I'm not aware of any country where that's worked. If someone can point one out to me, I'd love to be educated. And I don't say that sarcastically. I say that sincerely as well. But everything I've learned about how austerity works is that it takes you, it gives you more of the same. So, yeah.
Hi. Is there any more talk about a multi-sector infrastructure bank?
I'm sorry,
Infrastructure bank?
an infrastructure bank. Well, certainly the president made reference to it in his State of the Union speech. It's certainly I mean, there was a bill in the last Congress, I think the Rosa DeLauro bill that I was a co-sponsor of. Lots of Dems were co-sponsors of. I don't know that too many Republicans signed on. So I think an infrastructure bank has got to be one of the tools, if you will, in our toolbox if we're going to make the kind of advances that we need to make. Because again, I will say, the environment is such that if we're going to rely just on the appropriations process to fund what we need to do, it's pretty clear that the appropriations process isn't going to get us there.
I'm wondering if there's anything in the bill that encourage people to look at climate change as they're making these infrastructure upgrades.
I know that there was language in the last WRDA bill, the 07 WRDA bill, that required the Corps to allow for climate change in terms of their studies. Eddie, I'm sorry to put you on the spot. Is there anything in the Sandy supplemental that makes specific reference to mitigating against climate change?
No, but it does make reference to using the best
available science.
The best available science when conducting the studies.
Okay.
Nothing specific to climate change. I actually don't believe.
Look, I would hope that the climate change deniers, I would hope that they would be willing to embrace reality. You know what I mean? I mean, as Governor Cuomo said, and I think he was absolutely right, we have a 100-year storm now every 2 years. I mean, something is changing, and for us to continue to say that it's, you know, cyclical or, you know, bad luck, I mean, is you know, we gotta embrace reality here and recognize that climate change is a real thing, and that we're going to have to start dealing with it.
In the
Where you need your microphone.
oh, sorry. I was just going to say, in the clean water and drinking water SRF part of the Sandy money, they do make resilience an eligible activity, and EPA has for the first time to define what resilience is, so that'll be an interesting exercise.
Yeah, and there's also resilience language, if I remember correctly, in the Army Corps section. So, yeah, so you're quite right. Thank you for pointing that out.
Well, I was just wondering, in terms of the clean water infrastructure bill that you're considering introducing, are you making any particular provisions for small or rural communities in terms of their debt burdens and being able to service that?
Yes, there would be loan forgiveness in the potential for loan forgiveness in the language of the bill. There would be potential for what the federal government refers to as negative interest. I love that. But yes, there would be an accommodation for communities that can't carry the you know, servicing the loan, and that exists now. I mean, I know we were able to get $4 million to rehab a sewage treatment plant for a tiny little community in my district called Greenport. Year-round population in Greenport is 2,100 people. They have their own sewage treatment facility. They were under a court order to reduce nitrogen loading in Long Island Sound, and they got $4 million from the SRF. Now, there is no way that a community with a tax base of 2,000 people is going to be able to handle that without having it disrupt other things. So we were able to get a great deal of that as forgivable advance.
You mentioned Senator Boxer's interest in the concept of infrastructure of national significance. And that's a concept that we at the EPA find intriguing as well, that there is going to be a federal role in certain kinds of things. Shouldn't there be a priority for that can be identified in that way? It's fairly easy to understand how that might work in the Senate. It's a little tougher to think about 435 districts in the House because certainly we're not going to pass major legislation that leaves out a large number of those 435 districts, but perhaps within an overall approach to infrastructure, whether it's water, whether it's transportation, whatever it might be, there might be a way of having an identified program that deals with that concept. Do you see that gaining traction anytime in the near future in the House?
I think it can. I mean, look, the Surface Transportation Bill Safety Loop had a provision for projects of national significance. And now, again, passed in a different era. I mean, Safety Loop, I think, passed with 15 dissenting votes in the House of Representatives. We don't pass post offices now with fewer than 15 dissenting votes. I do think that there is the potential for the House to embrace projects of national significance.
Hi, I was wondering if there's any provision in the bill or any of the measures that you've spoken of for green infrastructure or for projects that will maybe be a smaller amount up front but will require ongoing maintenance?
There is a green infrastructure provision in our wastewater infrastructure bill. Somewhat controversial, by the way. Some people don't like that.
Sure.
But we do have it, yes.
Along those lines, what about sustainable and environmental management of the water infrastructure facilities and energy efficiency, renewable energy, and that kind of thing?
Is that a component of our bill?
Yeah.
I don't think that it is, and so that's something that I would like to, if you want to help work with us on that, I'd be happy to do that.
The term infrastructure has an awful lot of meanings. As a steward of federal infrastructure, I understand I'm very interested in the future of the Civilian Realignment Act. I understand it was reintroduced last week. Can you say anything about its prospects, what the politics are that relate to it, that have held it in the last two Congresses?
You have much more knowledge on this subject than I do, so talk to me about the Civilian Realignment. What is it?
Well, I can't speak for every federal agency, but mine in particular, which I wear on my lapel, NASA, is 50% smaller in terms of the dollars that we have to conduct our programs. And yet, over the time that we've reduced our budget by 50% in real terms, our facilities are at 150% of where they were when we peaked. And so facilities are a very large burden on a relatively smaller agency.
So tell me what the Civilian Realignment Act would do.
So the theory is that the principles that guided BRAC to allow the DoD to step out of a political context and deal with some contraction and realignment issues in an effective way should be applied to the civilian part of the federal government's infrastructure as well. So that's the principle of the bill. I understand it's been introduced in, I think, the last two Congresses, but doesn't seem to get out.
You know who the sponsor is?
I don't.
I don't want to be glib and comment on something that I obviously know almost nothing about. So I will have to take your question and do a little research, and then if you could leave your card with my colleague, I'd be happy to get back to you. I'm sorry, I just don't know.
Thank you.
By the way, when I first started running for Congress, somebody asked me a question, and I said, I have no idea. I don't know the answer. And I was with a reporter was trailing me that day, and he said, you know, I've never heard an elected official or a candidate to be an elected official say, I don't know. And I said to him, if I may be a little profane for a second, I said to him that I was a college administrator, and I spent 29 years in rooms full of students. And the very best bullshit detectors in the world are students. And I learned not to try to bluff my way through an answer when I don't know the answer. Anyway. Other questions? Obviously, I'm running out of things I know, so.
Given what we've already talked about with the Sandy recovery, the need for the EPA to define resilience, the need to build up to design standards rather than previous performance standards, how do your constituents and how do you view the balance between planning properly versus getting things done as soon as possible in the recovery process?
That's such a great question, and it's very difficult. I mean, when you've got you know, your entire life savings sunk into your home and you're living in a hotel room, your primary focus is to get back to that home. At the same time, you know, we I think have an obligation to, if we're going to be assisting in the rebuilding of that home or the refurbishment of that home, we have some obligations, it seems to me, to try to do it in a way that will allow it to withstand future storms. One of the things for my district that the Corps has, and we're going to be looking very carefully at this, is elevating homes along the shoreline. Another potential, there's actually three areas, three potential funding pools for that. There's the Corps under its jurisdiction, under its authorization of what's called Fire Island Montauk Point Reformulation Study. The CDBG money could be used at the discretion of the state to elevate or relocate. And then and hazard mitigation grant money under FEMA could also be used. So I think that's going to be a challenge, and it's going to be a challenge for the property owners, it's going to be a challenge for local government, and it's going to be a challenge for the state government, because let's remember, with the exception of the Corps, how we spend the FEMA money, hazard mitigation money, and how we spend the CDBG money is going to be determined at either the state level or the county level. So I think it's a real, I mean, it's a tightrope that we're going to have to make sure that we maintain our balance on to assist people restoring their, getting their lives back to normal as quickly as possible, if that is in fact possible. And for some communities, it's just not possible. I mean, but at the same time, doing it in a way that's responsible and in a way that recognizes long-term challenge.
I wonder if you could comment on the role of mitigation in a new WRDA bill. In the 2007 WRDA mitigation for civil works projects was associated on par with the 404 regulatory program. There's been some criticism about the way that that's been approached. Is that potentially an area for added attention, or is that an area perhaps where the budget would be balanced?
Well, I think it has to be an area for increased attention. I mean, I think we've had so many reminders of how vulnerable we are, and we also have technologies and innovation that lets us know how we can help, how we can withstand some of that. So I think mitigation has to play a more prominent role than it has in the past, and I don't know whether my colleagues agree or not, but that's certainly how I will be approaching it.
FEMA has, in New Jersey, New York, they have issued what they're calling advisory flood maps, which provide information for the communities in their recovery process, and in effect to elevate higher. There's another piece to that story, and that is the Bigger Waters Act that modified and reformed the Flood Insurance Act that in effect will phase out subsidies. So people that do not bill back to those advisories will at some point in time be faced with very, very expensive flood insurance. Do you care to comment on that?
Again, it's a challenge, but if the federal government is going to be the insurer of last resort, which is basically what the flood insurance program is, I think the federal government has, I think it's prudent for the federal government to say, look, we can't keep coming back claim after claim after claim. So it's a very tough area, but I think that, I think, withholding subsidies is something that my own view is prudent. I mean, so, and I say that representing an area that's got lots of homes that are, included in the floodplain. So, but I just look. I mean, like I said, if we're gonna, storm after storm, handle claims without any change in behavior, I'm not sure that's the wisest path for the federal government to take. That, by the way, will just become a 30-second ad.
Despite the inclusion of resilience in the Sandy language, the administration still hasn't released revisions to the principles and guidelines as WRDA 2007 requested. So we're still planning new projects based on economic development as the sole goal. Do you have any comments on?
Well, we've been pushing OMB to develop their guidance as quickly as possible for the Sandy regulations, so that agencies that are absolutely vital in recovery, like the Corps, know what they can do and or what they should do. So I think the guidance needs to be formulated. I hope it's done so as quickly as possible, but I think it has to deal with issues like resilience. I think again, you got two choices with reality, and one of them is to accept it. And the reality is that we've got year after year, season after season, we're dealing with weather-related natural disasters that require us to respond.
Let me ask one final question. I know we will let you go right at the top of the hour. I want to get your opinion on the issue of revenues, and revenue particularly for infrastructure. You mentioned Chairman Schuster's first hearing where the issue of revenue was front and center, and there seemed to be a greater openness to exploring whether it's the gas tax or other tools to raise revenue. There's also a lot of talk about tax reform happening in this Congress, and just your views on whether either through modification of existing revenue streams or through tax reform, the creation of new streams or other sorts of innovative finance tools that might be used to provide greater revenues for infrastructure investment.
My own view is all of the above. We have not raised the motor fuels tax since 1993. We have not raised the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund in a long, long time. We haven't raised the Inland Waterways Trust Fund fee, I think, since 1993 as well. We have increased demand, increased cost, and a diminished revenue stream. And so we only have a couple of choices. We either do less, and by the way, you all remember that the mantra of the D-N.Y committee in the 112th Congress is let's do more with less. How'd that work out? When you have less, you do less. That's just the cold hard truth. And we have lots of needs, we have lots of aspirations, and we're going to need more revenue. And the other way I would put it is this, and forgive me for going slightly off the topic. We spend $3.6 trillion a year, federal government. 48 cents of every dollar we spend is on people over the age of 65. 18 cents of every dollar we spend is on national defense, and 9 cents of every dollar we spend is on interest on the national debt. That's 75 cents of every dollar we spend is in just 3 areas. So something has to give here, and one of the things that I think has to give is that if we are going to continue to have the aspirations that we have, and I don't just mean we, the government, I mean we, the people of the United States, I mean what people want to spend money on. There is only one area of the federal government where more than 50% of the American people think we should cut. Anybody want to guess what it is?
80 people in the world.
No? Yeah, well, yes, foreign aid, basically. Everybody else, every single other area of the federal government, people want to spend more than we're spending, yet they also say we have to cut our spending. So, obviously those two sentiments do not align, but I think we need to be very, very careful about where we spend our money. I think we have to grapple with an aging population. We have to grapple with lots of things. But one of the ways we have to do that is with more revenue, and whether it is user fee-based revenue, such as the Highway Trust Fund, such as the Inland Waterways Trust Fund, or whether it is closing loopholes. But let's remember, our Republican colleagues have said that they're all for tax reform, but they want it to be revenue neutral. So I don't know what that gets us in terms of solving problems, in terms of problems that can only be fixed with money, like dredging a harbor. There, by the way, is no, cost-free way of dredging a harbor, right? There's no cost-free way of building a sewage treatment facility or laying the pipe for it. So I think we have to, look, I mean, we're in a discussion this week and for the last several weeks of whether we take a spending-only approach to solving our problems or we take a balanced approach. This is one of those areas where I believe we need to take a balanced approach where we have to be, make the types of prudent reductions in our expenditures that we can make, but at the same time we have to generate some additional revenue. Revenue as a proportion of GDP, federal revenue as a proportion of GDP, is lower than it's been at any time since World War II. So, anyway, with that I'll stop. Thank you all very much.